Do you have a favorite Friends episode? Or maybe it's not a particular episode, but it's more like a scene. Mine is the pivot scene with Ross and Rachel and Chandler. And you probably remember that one if you ever watch Friends at all. But in case you forgot, here's a clip.
Yes! Oh, here we go. Pivot! 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 Pivot!
That scene still cracks me up all these years later, and I've seen it like 5 times. So the TV show Friends has been one of the most popular shows of all time. It ran for 236 episodes from September 1994 to May 2004, and it's still a popular show, and it's still attracting new and younger viewers. So in this episode, I want to explore some of the reasons why Friends became so popular and why it has endured all of these years. So let's go back to the beginning and talk about how this show first came about. So the show was created by David Crane and Marta Kauffman. Both were TV scriptwriters and producers of lesser well-known shows. And the title went through changes even before it aired. So when they first created the show, it was called Insomnia Cafe. Then they changed the title to Six of One, then Friends Like Us, and then finally it was shortened to just Friends. And I think this was a smart move to begin with because the word friends has a positive connotation. It's short and it's memorable versus something like Insomnia Cafe or Six of One. So already they made a smart move, and that was just the beginning. Now, the original concept and scripts went through several rewrites, and there was even this suggestion by NBC to include a 7th older person in the cast because they were worried that since all of the other characters were going to be in their 20s, there wouldn't be enough people to watch. Older people wouldn't tune in because they were like, okay, this is just a show about people in their 20s. I'm in my 40s or 50s or whatever. So why would I watch this show? So this character was a police officer named Pat the Cop, and they even had cast the part. But the writers hated this 7th role so much that they went to NBC and suggested something else, which was, we will bring in older cast members for guest roles, like the parents, and maybe they date someone who's older. Like I know Tom Selleck was on the show. So NBC agreed to that, and they were able to keep just the main 6 characters. Again, I think this was a good choice, and I'm glad that they pleaded with NBC on this because I think having a 7th older person would have messed up the dynamics and the camaraderie that the 6 end up having. So by this point, they have a good script and name. Now let's get into the casting because every good show must have good actors and actresses supporting those roles. If you have bad actors, then the show is probably doomed. The whole casting process took 3 to 4 months, and the casting team went through over 1,000 headshots per role and whittled it down to 75 applicants for the 6 leads. And part of that process was looking for attractive people in their 20s and early 30s. So now I'm going to break down each role, and I'm going to go in order from the first role to be cast to the last. So the first person to be cast was David Schwimmer, who played Ross. And he was the only cast member who did not have to audition. And this is because the show's executive producer, Kevin Bright, was already familiar with Schwimmer's work. And they even wrote the role of Ross with Schwimmer in mind. But shockingly, David initially turned this offer down because he had already moved back to Chicago to focus on theater, and that was because he had had a negative experience with a different television pilot. And as a side note, I always thought he looked older than the others, and I was shocked to find that he was only 27 when he got this role and not the oldest. He was the third oldest. But to me, whenever I watched the show, I thought he looked like he was maybe 38, 39. And I thought he was great in the part. I just always thought he looked older than the other cast members. The next person who was cast was Lisa Kudrow as Phoebe, and she was brought in for the very first casting session. They were already familiar with her through her work at the improv company The Groundlings in LA and for her guest appearances on Mad About You. So Kudrow played the role consistently the same way until the very last moment when she decided to pitch an entirely alternate Phoebe. And this different Phoebe wasn't as funny. So Kaufman and casting director Ellie Canner both suggested Kudrow go back to the original Phoebe, which she did. And then the network approved her to play that role. And Canner said later on that if Kudrow had stuck to her alternate Phoebe that she suggested, then she may not have ever been approved to play the role. And then next we have Matt LeBlanc, who was cast as Joey. Now, he had an interesting story. He arrived at his final callback for the role with a massive scab on his nose. And what had happened is a friend had suggested that they go out drinking the night before because that's, quote, what friends would do. And in the middle of the night, Matt LeBlanc gets up to go to the restroom, blacks out, and hits his nose on the toilet seat. And then when he went to his audition the next day, Marta Kaufman asked him what had happened to his face, and Matt told the truth. And the creators thought this was something that Joey would do, so that's ultimately what won him the role. Another thing that was interesting about Matt LeBlanc's audition for this role and getting cast as a part of Joey is that he only had $11 in his bank account at the time. And with his first check from the show, he didn't buy anything fancy, he just bought a hot meal. Some other interesting tidbits is that Vince Vaughn also auditioned for the role, but this was before he was famous. And also the character of Joey was originally written to be a slick womanizer, but LeBlanc had had such an innocent warmth vibe to him during the audition that they decided to tailor the role to fit that. The next person to be cast was Courtney Cox in the role of Monica. Now, she was the most well-known at the time, and producers initially asked her to audition for the part of Rachel, and they did give her that role. They offered that to her, but she pushed to audition for the role of Monica, and obviously they decided that was a better role for her and gave her the part. And as a side note, the character of Monica was originally going to be a blue-collar New Yorker who was tough, cynical, and sarcastic. I'm not sure why they decided to change it, but I wonder if they realized maybe that character wouldn't fit in with the rest of the friend group, or maybe that character wouldn't be as likable as the others. The next person who was cast was Matthew Perry as Chandler. Initially, he was unavailable due to a commitment to a sci-fi pilot called LAX 2194, but the executives at NBC saw that pilot and realized it was terrible, so Perry was allowed to audition. Once that pilot failed, then Matthew Perry was able to officially join the cast of Friends. And another thing interesting about that whole process of casting Chandler is that Matthew Perry's friend, Craig Bierko, had auditioned and been offered the part first. But Craig received another offer from a different show and sort of at the last minute decided to take the other offer. And then Matthew Perry stepped in and auditioned and got the part, and then we know what happened after that. But I can't imagine how Craig must have felt after he realized that he turned down this dream part and accepted a role on a different show that ultimately failed. And then his friend Matthew Perry takes over the role, or gets offered the role. And then that show takes off and Matthew Perry becomes hugely famous, hugely successful. And I listened to Matthew Perry's book recently on audio, and he said that Craig didn't speak to him for a couple of years after that. And I can see why. That must have been very difficult for him. Also, Jon Cryer and Jon Favreau were considered for Chandler. And obviously they didn't get the part, but at least these two went on to have very successful careers. Now, as we know, Perry passed away in 2023. I'll talk more about that later on. Finally, we had Jennifer Aniston, who was cast in the role of Rachel. She was the last one to officially sign on. So she was cast in April of 1994, but like Matthew Perry, she was already committed to another show. The show that she had already committed to was called Muddling Through. So the casting department of Friends tried to recast Rachel, but decided the only course of action was to convince Aniston to film both shows. So what ended up happening is they filmed the first few episodes with Aniston, knowing that they may have to reshoot these episodes with a different actress if Muddling Through was picked up for more episodes. And I'm sure Jennifer Aniston is very happy that they ended up doing that. But NBC had a plan. So CBS moved Muddling Through to Saturday nights during the summer. And NBC's scheduler, Preston Beckman, was ordered to kill off that show, the Muddling Through show. So Beckman scheduled TV films based on Danielle Steel novels for Saturday nights at that same time. I'm going to interrupt this episode for just a moment to tell you about my website, shop8099.com, where you can find various products with designs and phrases inspired by the 80s and 90s. I personally put a lot of thought into every design, and I don't use AI because I want them to come from me personally. Every sale helps support the channel, so when you get a chance, please check it out. That's shop8099.com, shop8099.com. And so their intention was to pull viewers away from Muddling Through, and it worked. That show was canceled. And this allowed Jennifer Aniston to sign on to Friends. So let's talk about all of this for a moment with the casting. So David Schwimmer originally turned down the role of Ross. Lisa Kudrow almost blew her audition. Matt LeBlanc was broke and showed up with a huge scab on his nose. Courtney Cox almost played Rachel. Matthew Perry and Jennifer Aniston almost weren't on the show due to contractual obligations to other shows. And then something that I didn't realize at the time, and maybe a lot of people didn't, or at least in the beginning stages of Friends, was that Matthew Perry was a serious addict. So luckily everything went right in the end, and once each role was cast, they had their first table read together at NBC. And Canner, the casting director, later said that you could just see that the chemistry was there right away. And she said it, quote, felt right. So yes, they were thorough in casting the parts, but you can only be so thorough up to a point. And then after that, you can still end up with bad chemistry on this set. So in my opinion, it was like lightning in a bottle, and it was like meant to be. This great on and off screen chemistry that they had was kind of just pure luck, in my opinion. Now, the creators from the beginning said they wanted a true ensemble show with characters getting roughly the same amount of screen time. And the cast took the advice of James Burrows, the co-creator of Cheers, who also directed the Friends pilot and 14 other episodes, to bond before the cameras started rolling. So they met on the set of Monica's apartment with the instructions to just talk to each other. And they said later on, the six of them, that there's like a natural flow to the conversation and they all got along. Courtney Cox, who was the most famous at the time, also reminded the rest of them of that. Apparently at lunch one day in the early days, she said something like, "There are no stars here. We're supposed to be friends, so let's really be that." Something to that effect. And I did listen to Matthew Perry's audiobook recently. I think I mentioned that earlier. But he wrote in his book that, quote, "From that first morning, we were inseparable. We ate every meal together. We played poker. And even though they had their own dressing rooms, they were often all together in one. And they would walk to their cars together and they would say goodnight to each other." So there was this off-screen bond that to this day has not been broken. And right before the show aired, they even went to Vegas together, and they were told by the director to enjoy their last days of being anonymous. Even after the show aired, they continued to stick by each other like true friends do. For example, they insisted on doing magazine covers together as a group so that no one person was on a magazine cover or just a couple of them. It had to be all six of them or none of them. They did the same thing when it came to awards. In the early years of the show, the cast only submitted their names in the supporting actor/actress categories for the Emmys. And that was because they felt like no one person was the lead. In 2002, they did start submitting themselves under the lead, but again, it was a group decision. We were all going to submit ourselves under the lead category. It wasn't a couple of you can submit under the lead category and the rest of us under the supporting actor or actress category. So again, a group decision. And they continued this group decision making when it came to their salaries. So for the show's third season, the six of them entered collective negotiations so that each person would earn the same. Up until then, they had been earning different salaries. And for seasons 9 and 10, if you remember this was a huge deal back then, but they commanded $1 million each per episode. And I think this move of sticking together did help the show because it helped them to each be happy. They couldn't look at their peer and say, well, that person's making more money than me. Knowing that you're showing up and you're doing your best and you're earning the same as every other main cast member on the show helps with the camaraderie, helps you be happy on the show and not want to leave. And it also helped them make more money. Another reason why Friends became so popular was just the characters themselves. They were funny and you liked them. And there was always this fun vibe of them hanging out. They would do things together. They were supportive of each other. And they had these stylish apartments in New York City. Meanwhile, for the rest of us, we're going to work, we're cleaning, we're running errands, things like that. So it became this escape, and it became something that people, particularly in their 20s and 30s at the time, wanted to be like. Who didn't at the time think, I would love to have a group of friends like this. I would love to have that stylish apartment and be out doing things instead of stuck in an office working or whatever. They were also relatable and went through things that we sometimes go through in our own lives, and it maybe gave us ideas of how to solve our own problems. And you saw the characters evolve and become more mature, and hopefully that's how we are in our own lives. We evolve and become more mature. Chandler and Monica got married. Rachel and Ross got married at one point. Didn't last, but they did get married at one point. and both of these couples had children. So you also had the variety as well. If you couldn't relate to one of these characters, then it didn't matter because there were 5 other characters that maybe you could relate to, or maybe you related to 3 of the 6 and you tuned in for those 3. And each one was unique as well. So again, if you didn't relate to one, that was okay because there were 5 others and you probably saw yourself in at least a couple of the characters. Also, certain characteristics of these characters caught on to the general public. Like, a lot of people remember Joey's "How You Doing?" and we had the Rachel haircut that a lot of women copied. So this show had an influence on culture outside of just that half-hour time slot. Also, it helped that they were all attractive, they were young, fashionable, and I mean, who doesn't want to have those 3 characteristics? Like, it was something that was enviable, and a lot of people wanted to be these characters. Something else that really helped popularize the show was the time slot. So it originally aired on Thursdays at 8:30 between Mad About You and Seinfeld. And those 2 shows were already really popular, especially Seinfeld, as we know. Later in the first season, it was moved to 9:30, but for most of the 10 seasons it was in that 8 p.m. Thursday night time slot. Back then, Thursdays between 8 and 10 was the coveted time slot. It's close to the weekend, so people are kind of getting into that weekend mindset, but it's not actually the weekend when people are busy out doing things, especially back then when people were more social and more likely to be out like on a Friday night, Saturday night, maybe even doing things Sunday night. And then you didn't want to necessarily put it on a Monday night when people were kind of in a bad mood. It's the start of the week. So Thursday was ideal. And that definitely helped popularize the show. Another reason why it became so popular was the lack of competition. These days we have Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, Paramount, YouTube, social media, and even within social media we have different platforms. So back then you had the main channels, CBS, NBC, ABC. There were cable channels as well, but most people watched the main channels for their entertainment. So knowing that, it kind of begs the question, would it be as popular today? And it's hard to say. I rewatched it recently and it was still funny and it aged well, I think, for the most part. But I don't think comedy is as popular as it used to be, which is kind of sad. A lot of the top shows these days are dramas and crime thrillers. Back then, Friends averaged 23 million views per episode. And compare that to something like Emily in Paris today gets 2.6 million views per episode on average. But then a show like The Last of Us gets around 37 million views per episode. So you have a lighter show that gets fewer views, and a darker sort of dramatic show gets a lot more views. And I kind of feel like social media posts go that way too. Sometimes the posts that are meaner and nastier, they get more views and commentary than people posting positive things. So there's like a cultural shift going on there. So I think it was just a matter of the right script with the right cast at the right time. Although it still is popular. It's not at the level it was, but it's been over 20 years since the final episode aired, and the show is still reportedly earning Warner Brothers $1 billion in syndication revenue a year. So $1 billion. That is a lot of money. So it's still popular and it still can be discovered and streamed at any time. It was on Netflix and now it's on HBO Max. So it's popular enough for these streaming platforms to pick it up. And I think part of that is because it dealt with universal themes for younger people, like career changes, dating, navigating friendships, and all of that stuff. Also, it took place before smartphones and social media, so it's a simpler time, and it was during a time when people did actually hang out more. And that's actually something that younger people are aspiring to. They are recognizing that maybe they're spending too much time on their phones. So Friends is picking up a lot of younger viewers, even to this day. I'm going to end this episode with my thoughts on Matthew Perry's death, because I did, like I said, recently listen to the audio version of his book, and he barely spoke about his time on the set or his friendships with others. And I don't think that was a negative thing. I think he did it out of loyalty. So something interesting is that none of these actors and actresses betrayed each other. There was never any person gossiping about someone else on the cast or anything like that. They never stabbed each other in the back. And so I think Perry just didn't talk about it because he's like, I'm still loyal to these people and I still consider them my friends. And when he died, in true Friends fashion, the other 5 released a joint statement. So not individual statements, they waited and collectively released a statement regarding his death. So this act demonstrated, to me at least, that even in death, they remained united and true friends to the very end. Bittersweet, right? Well, that's all I have for you in this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll come back. In the meantime, take care.